You're listening to Crushing Club Marketing, a podcast for progressive club leaders ready to increase their club's revenue. Time for change begins right now. In the big picture of club improvements, updating bylaws and reviewing governance is about as uninteresting and unsexy as it gets. Most club leaders would rather spend these golden years of private clubs dreaming up capital improvements, which is great, but taking care of governance also matters. In this episode, we check in with David Chag and Denise Kuprionis from the Club Council to talk about club governance and why it matters for the health of your club today and in the future. I can just imagine you right now. You're frantically looking for your phone, trying to find that stop button to skip this episode. But before you do, just give me a second. This is good stuff. Especially if you've had culture issues at your club recently, or maybe ever, or if you feel like there's a level of distrust or confusion about how things, quote unquote, work at the club, stick around. If you want to grow membership, your club has to be financially and culturally healthy. We know that because you know what it looks like when a club in your market is in trouble. Everyone knows because people are gossiping. And did you hear about what's happening at that club? And apparently they're having issues with that, right? And when you're the club that's being talked about, it's just never fun. So that said, no club is perfect. And every member wants to love their club. And most members do, but occasionally members get crossed. Communication is unclear, or worst case, the club gets sideways. So it's times like these that club governance might need to be reviewed. Bylaws, they may need to be rewritten. And, it might be time for change. So David Chag and Denise Kuprionis are partners at the Club Council. Now, if you're not familiar with the Club Council, they're consultants comprised of some of the most respected minds in the private club industry. And as it says on their website, they are a trusted authority for guiding your club through critical projects and providing insights on the evolving industry landscape and best practices. Their founding partners have served as general managers, board members, and club presidents. So there's a good chance of these two, David and Denise. And David and I met many years ago at a CMAA Communication Summit. And he and his team were kind enough to invite me to the country club in Brookline, Mass, to conduct a workshop with his leaders. Now, if you know David, you know he's one of the great leaders in the private club world. He spent 13 years at the Houston Country Club and then spent more than 35 years at the country club before turning over the keys to the current GM, Kristen LeCount, who's fabulous if you know Kristen as well. So I'm honored to know David. And when I first reached out to David, he said, you really need to interview Denise Kuprionis. She's a governance guru at the Club Council. So Denise has 25 years of board governance experience across different industries. So yeah, she knows her way around private clubs and how to govern complex organizations. She was a 6-year board member at Kenwood Country Club in Cincinnati and served 2 years as club president. So Denise is not a career private club industry professional. She spent a lot of time in private clubs, as you might imagine. In fact, she actually spent most of her career in business as chief compliance and ethics officer at the Scripps Company. So it gives her a big picture of governance in a lot of different organizations. So here we go. You ready for a little club therapy? Here is my conversation with David and Denise. Denise and David, thanks so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Now, this might not seem for some people like the most, this is it might not be the sexiest topic, right? But it is so critical for so many clubs. In my mind, it's everything. Without, great governance and bylaws that people understand and that make sense, you're sort of blown in the wind, right? For people that are, maybe new to a board even, how do you discern or, what's the difference between governance and bylaws?
So the bylaws are a very important document, and it dictates what the authority of the board is. Oftentimes it'll talk about the processes used for nominations and meetings and things like that. So the bylaws are kind of the controlling document in how the club operates. Oftentimes the folks will not look at the bylaws too often just because they're kind of that legal document and they're something that we don't refer to a whole lot. I like to use another governance document is board governance guidelines, which is kind of the plain English version of the bylaws. A better way to explain what the governance guidelines are is we know that committees should have charters which talk about how the committee does its work. What's the objective? What's the mission of the committee? What are its responsibilities? What's the committee composition? What are the logistics? Those kinds of things. The board governance guidelines are kind of the charter for how the board does its work. Getting back to your the first question, when we talk about board governance is really the framework of systems that the board uses to help directors make decisions, to help directors determine club direction, just to establish the monitoring tools that they're going to use to foster club sustainability. So club governance is kind of this big thing. The bylaws are an important governing document, and then you have other governing documents also. Both CMAA and NCA recently wrote a book on some of these governance ideas, and one thing that they promote, and David and I are strong advocates of too, is that every club have a board policy manual. And within that is some of the, it goes a little more in depth than what your bylaws might do, and talk about the processes and the protocols that the board uses to carry out its responsibilities.
Yeah, and I'd add that when it comes to the bylaw element of it, it's not unusual for clubs to not revisit the bylaws on an annual basis. They kind of get reproduced, they're part of a book, whatever it is, and people say, oh, it's the same thing year after year. And it's not really addressed, and it's be good to have some type of system in place where you at least acknowledge it, look at it, and understand clubs evolve, bylaws need to evolve.
For
And
sure.
not every club practices according to the bylaws. And I can tell you there were things that we were doing that, the bylaws are great as a tool and document, as Denise says, but the actual practices evolve over time and they can evolve differently. And if you don't sit back and look at them at least annually and talk about the bylaw structure, the governance structure, how they're operating together, you can go for a period of time and go astray with some of these things. So getting clubs to understand the importance of at least reviewing it and talking about it on a regular basis is a good thing.
So if just from a straw poll, like if you're, in your experience in the industry and conversations that you have with clients or with peers of yours, how many clubs or what percentage of clubs do you think actually really adhere to their bylaws? Whether it's strictly or 80%, what percentage of clubs do you think are doing that?
Gosh, I'd jump in and say, I think a majority of the clubs are really striving to work according to bylaws. And I think when we talk about being off from some of the bylaws, it's a small percentage. It's not a large one, in my opinion. I look at it and go, I think they just don't, like for us, I mean, we've been around 130 years at the country club, and you look at it and just say, we developed over time a position on the board to be a governance position, so that we were constantly talking about it at board level with reporting and understanding what is happening. And someone was focused on the parts of it. And I think that's more the evolution today. The clubs, they're thinking more about bylaws. They're thinking more about governance. They're paying attention to it more, which is very helpful.
Yeah, but I would add to that the bylaws are kind of the overriding governing document. Your board policy manual, as I said, goes a little bit deeper. I think David's point that periodically we need to review the bylaws is so important, because one thing that we have seen in many clubs, as boards have evolved, as clubs are evolving their board governance model. More clubs, in the old days, so to speak, club boards were very involved, for example, in operations, right? And clubs are now moving away from that and moving to a true governance role where the board's role is oversight. We can go more into detail about what the board's role is, but my point is many of the bylaws don't reflect that. So I would say in many of the bylaws that we looked at, the bylaws put all authority to running daily operations at the board level.
Mhm.
And that's not what we want to see as governance evolves, because we want the general manager or the CEO, whichever title you're using, they should be in charge of operations, and the board is oversight and strategic and making sure you have the right general manager, CEO in place, right? And the GM, CEO should be direct. The board only has one employee, and we want to make sure that that employee has the responsibility and that it's clearly defined in those bylaws. I would say that's an area that we see often needs to be amended
Mhm.
in the bylaws.
And
And
David, I want to go. Can I go
well,
back to something you said? You said that they're thinking about it more.
Mhm.
Why is that? What's causing that to happen?
Well, I think clubs are evolving, and well, board governance is everywhere. Is almost anymore. You can't pick up like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times without reading about a public company or a private company, the board governance, and the author of the article will say the board messed up on this or the board did a great job on this. So everybody is more aware of how governance happens. And your club members, the members of your club, they're reading this. They're serving on nonprofit boards or maybe public company or private company boards, and they're seeing, oh, they're putting these processes in place, right? They're looking at who's on the board. You know what? It's not just succession planning for the board and grooming new leaders is particularly important at clubs because they're transitional leaders, right? You have new people coming in. Oftentimes I've said to general managers, gosh, I think you have the worst job in the world simply because in this regard, you have a president that comes in and maybe serves for a year or 2 years. And they're saying, if I was the president at the country club and David was general manager, I'm saying, this is how we're going to do things. And then next year he gets a new president that comes in and says, oh, no, we're not doing that. We're going to do it a different way. So the reason that's this continuity of board practices is, I think, one of the reasons that our CEOs and general managers are more in tune to board governance too, and understanding why it's important to them, because the better relationship they have with their board and the more defined the roles are, the better board relationship and better CEO relationship is just going to make members happier and the GM with a better, happier position.
I think to Denise's point, you get to the evolution of the GM to COO to CEO. It's this evolution that empowers an individual to be consistent at an operation, whereas the people at the board level are turning over. And to your point, Ed, I thought of immediately is number one, transparency. There's more transparency today than there's ever been as to these boards, how they operate, committees, accountability. So there's transparency and then there's accountability. And so people coming into these roles want to be sure that they're doing the right job. And what is it that's in place that's telling them they're doing the right job? Well, if that information hasn't been reviewed over time, they don't know. And if the leader of the organization is not empowered in a way and challenged professionally in a way to be doing the type of onboarding and reviews of information, et cetera, of whether committee members, board members, et cetera, for that consistency factor, then you tend to fall behind. And I think last is communication. You look at it look at what you're doing, Ed. I mean, people want communication. They expect information yesterday. They're not going to wait till the end of the month like they used to. So there's this feeling for communication and what's going on, and a timeliness to it that really holds you accountable, and it's just more transparency.
Yeah, in so many ways, it's what I hear you both saying, and what keeps going through my mind is that also that there seems to be general distrust in a lot of leadership roles for whatever reason today, and a lot of people, there's generally, I think, a lot of people thinking that there's maybe something nefarious going on, or something that maybe not quite, but something that's just not right. Like people are they're not playing by the rules, right? And that need for, like, that transparency, like you're saying, David, and for people to, process wise, to say, no, we have a process that we actually adhere to, and people that are serving that can see that. But I'm wondering, how often are bylaws usually updated? Like, is there a rule of thumb? And then, my second part of that is, like, what are the signs that maybe bylaws are outdated, or the way the club is operating? Like, what are the things that you see, or when people come to you and say, hey, this is happening, what are those signs, and how often should they be reviewed?
Well, I think that reviewing the bylaws on an annual basis is a good idea, but the bylaws are every detail should not of how the club is run is not contained in the bylaws. That's the reason we have these board policy manuals, because that's where kind of the details. And I think you mentioned uh, some member, it's the, we want members traditionally. I think we're seeing more members involved in voicing maybe concerns about the board, about boards and what boards are doing. If the board has been working kind of in the closet, so to speak, or in the upstairs room, and nobody knows what's going on, right? The board needs to be transparent. The board has to understand, we talk about the board is accountable. David mentioned accountability, and the board, the board only acts as one, so the board is accountable to itself. The board is also accountable to its fellow directors. The board is accountable to the general manager, and the board is accountable to the members, right? And they need to remember that. Directors need to understand what their role is. We have to define these roles, and often that is done again in the board policy manual. But directors, we talked earlier about kind of this evolution, and why are we seeing more interest in board governance today than we have in the past? And a lot of it is because the board members are really starting to understand that they have a real job, right? And oftentimes in nonprofits, board members forget that they have fiduciary responsibilities. So a board member at a club has the same fiduciary responsibilities that one of your large non-public or public company boards have. They're the same fiduciary responsibilities, but sometimes we forget about this duty of care and duty of loyalty and what that means. Sometimes I think that I've said to other board members at clubs, I think board members at clubs have a really hard job, harder maybe even than a public company or a nonprofit company board, because at clubs, we're usually members of clubs because we love our club. We are passionate about our club. In my case, I tell people my club it's my happy place. I love to go up there and be a part of it, right? Whether it's playing golf or having a cocktail. But the problem with that is, as a board member, if you're a board member of your local nonprofit, whether it's, United Way or the Girl Scouts or whatever, or a public company, you do all your prep work, right? You should have advanced materials. You do all that same thing as you do at your club board. You get prepared for those board meetings. The difference at your non-public or your public and private nonprofit boards is you do your work and then you go away. A club director, I'm going up there for a cocktail tonight.
Right. Yeah.
See my fellow board members who I'm accountable to. So it's really kind of, it puts your club directors in a more precarious kind of situation, of keeping material confidential until it's time to be distributed to board members, and yet at the same time listening to members about what they want.
See, Denise, I agree with that. I look at it and think for board members, Ed, you opened up with a trust factor of people that are in the leadership roles. A lot of it today is relying upon proper communication. And you look at clubs, they've really developed the type of communications that you wouldn't have thought of 10 years ago. And the departments that you have in place, it's like a communications department didn't exist before. It was probably someone with another responsibility at the club that was doing a monthly news bulletin or something that went out. But the understanding of communication today and closing that gap that exists with trust, because if they don't hear anything, they begin to speculate. They begin to talk at the cocktail bar. They talk in the locker rooms or on the golf course about, this is what I think is happening, rather than this is what is happening. And I know we have the constant argument about people not reading the information that gets put out, but on the other hand, it's insurance. If you're ahead of it with communications, you're thoughtful and being timely in the type of information you're disseminating, factual, asking for people to participate or give questions back, it counters that feeling of trust that can exist out there, or lack thereof.
But when you take the communications piece and you spin it in a different way, saying, no, we need to create transparent communication, and we need people who actually help us with that. Because let's face it, as a board, we may not be so good at that, but someone in the room needs to go, hang on a second, what's the messaging around this?
Oh, absolutely. I think when you look at communications tag, take a capital project where you're trying to get members to buy into it, then you're scheduling the capital project, what's going to go on, and interference of member services, things of that nature, and then the post part of it. Once you start putting together a capital project, and not once you start, I mean, even before, you're paralleling that with a communications project. There are things you have to be ahead of when it's a very complex capital project. You have to be ahead of those factors in communicating with members and helping them understand what's about to come, why it's coming, reinforcing the fact that we want your feedback, et cetera. So the communication tool is so critical to follow a capital project or other projects you do at the club. And we didn't always think of it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How much? Go ahead, Denise.
I was going to say, I use his line a lot. One of his lines is in the communication is, we have to bring members along. And that is what's so important. Too often, if all of a sudden you just say to members, we were just working with another club and they're going to be really doing some significant board governance changes, but they have to bring members along. So we've been helping them with the communications. How do we talk to the board, or how do we talk to members? How do we share what we're doing? And let's get their input, right? Let's just don't all of a sudden say, this is what we're going to do, right? Let's get some input. As David would say, let's bring them along.
It's the same thing. We talk about this internally as Storyteller, which is like, how do I get buy-in? Well, you get buy-in by asking people and engaging them in the conversation, so they feel like, all right, we're all doing this together and challenging each other. I'm curious, how are clubs adapting, or how does this sort of shifting demographic of clubs, like we hear this all the time, right? Like, we need younger members, or we need to focus on younger members, and how are we going to bring them in? Has that created a need for reevaluating bylaws and how clubs are being governed? Is there anything with that at all?
I don't think it creates a need to change anything in the bylaws, but certainly it's an important issue when we talk about who's in the boardroom, right? And this is maybe particularly important at clubs. It's so we have to think of, and something that clubs have not done traditionally, think about succession planning for the board and for its committee leadership positions. We think traditionally at clubs, oh, we have our annual meeting next week. Oh, okay, who's going to run for the board? And then all of a sudden we do it. Instead of sitting back and, succession planning for the board in leadership positions should be really a year-long process, right? We have to think about who's at the table, right? We need speaking just kind of generally here, because it's who's at the table is important, is a little bit unique to each club. But generally speaking, you're going to want somebody that really has some good financial background, some accounting background, that really knows how to read the financial statements. Oftentimes, you're going to want somebody with a legal background on the board. And if you have a big, when you're thinking about who's going to be on the board and what skills you need, it always starts with strategy, right? Where's our club going? If we really need to evolve and move into, think more about next gen issues, or if we're having a big project, who on the board brings that perspective? We want to make sure that in the boardroom, not only do we have these particular skills that we need, but we also want to make sure that we have a diversity. Do we have enough men on the board? Do we have enough women on the board? Do we have people that represent tennis on the board? Do we have people that represent golf on the board? Do we have a varied age groups on our board? It's really important to get all those perspectives, and thinking that through is not something you do 2 weeks before your annual meeting. This is about succession planning and really spending time thinking about who's going to be our next leaders and who do we want to be on the board.
You know, the other thing I would add to that in the governance area, dealing with younger generation coming up into it that are now getting onto committees, or you want them on committees and getting involved, is respecting the time element that's there. And you look at today's Zoom meetings that obviously were introduced during COVID, and what came out of it, and the way people operate today is there's just a demand. People want to know, but if they're going to be engaged, you need to evaluate how you're governing, how you're working them into it so that it's convenient for them.
Right.
And you want their feedback, you want them there, but it'd be tough to think that everybody can make every meeting in person today. So I think that the way that they operate in their busy lives and how they function changes the type of practices you have in place to evolve with it.
Right. Even down to, you're asking members who are volunteers to do this, make that time count. Like you were saying earlier, Denise, it's like, hey, if you're still running board meetings with cocktails, my guess is you may not be like using that time as effectively as you might be able to if you ran it like a real, business meeting. Because if it's going to be a big waste of time for people to sit in a board meeting, forget it. This is it's ridiculous.
And Ed, we learned that when it came to board agendas. We had people come into the boardroom and they'd each give their report from their committee. And people were falling asleep at the board table because we've already got the information out there for them, but everybody wanted their opportunity to speak at the board table. And we had to change that dynamic in the agenda so that people knew that the time they were sitting there was valuable time. It was strategic time. It was thinking time. And it wasn't sitting back. If someone didn't have interest in a swimming pool, they didn't want to know about how many bathers were in the water and other things that went on. They just want to think more. As Denise would say, you have a hat that you represent all contingents when you're at the board level. And you want to make sure that the value add for people being there is valuable to them, and you're not wasting their time with other information. So getting the type of strategic agendas, the education on the agenda, bringing people in like that at board meetings or committee meetings really changes the dynamic of the way it used to be.
Yeah. Again, it's sort of like what we were saying earlier, which is don't dive into the minutia. Try to avoid the minutia, because you're really trying to look out for what's in the best interest of the club, not how many people are using the swimming pool and things like that. I'm wondering, though, what you see along the lines of like updating bylaws. Do clubs often just sort of Frankenstein, like, oh, well, let's make this little change here? There's like, how often do bylaws actually just need to be revamped? Like start to finish, let's, really explore this and take this thing apart rather than saying, oh, let's just tweak that or tweak this.
I would say most of the bylaws that we've had the opportunity to review don't need to be completely revamped, because keep in mind the bylaws are the high level rules, right? What needs to be revamped is how you carry out those responsibilities that are talked about in the bylaws. So generally, it's not the bylaws that have to be totally revamped. Now, I was working with a club not long ago, and theirs really did need to be revamped. But most of them, they don't need really big structural changes. Generally, they're pretty good because they're not the details. It talks about the general board's responsibilities, with the exception of, I would say, the one exception to that is that many bylaws that we see still delegate the responsibilities for running the club at the board level. And that's usually that's a big change that I think that many bylaws need to be amended. But for the most part, there's not, the bylaws aren't just like, oh, let's just throw them out and start all over, right? Because it's the high level piece. It's how you carry out the board's business and how you prepare board members. David mentioned, several good things in his just comments. One was talking about preparing board members to serve. Right. So first, it's that whole succession planning, trying to figure out who are your next board members, who are the next directors, your next club leaders. But then it's preparing them for service. So, I like to think there's an orientation. You have to have a fulsome orientation program. And when I talk about orientation, it's generally that one time meeting that might be 3 hours that's going to really show you how the sausage is made. What are the financials, talk about what we expect of our board members, what are the responsibilities of a director. And then you have onboarding, and onboarding might be a 2-month, 3-month kind of process where, maybe you pair them up. You have a board buddy for a couple of months where you can, that board buddy might talk with the new board member right before the board meeting and say, hey, here's something we've been talking about. Because keep in mind, joining a board, any board, is really like jumping on a moving train, right? It doesn't stop. So the board has been talking about issues for a while. So having this board buddy kind of helps you get up to speed. And then it's about continuing education for your board members. How do they continually, we strive and we want our general managers and the folks that report to the general manager, we want them to keep educated, right? We want them to keep learning what's going on in their industry, whether it's culinary or something else or golf. Well, what are the board members doing to continue to learn, be educated too? Because, usually there's only one expert in the room, in each boardroom, and that's the general manager, right? How do we continue that learning? The other thing that David mentioned, rightly so, and he said very well, was about preparing the agendas for those board meetings, right? That's another way that they're educated. But you have to really be thoughtful about what's on the agenda and making sure that we talk about that. I would say, and there's not a magic number here, but 80% of what's on the agenda should be forward looking at the board level, not backward looking. There has to be a little bit of backward looking because you got to know what what did we do last month? What's our operating profit and all that kind of thing. But most of it, at the board level, should be strategic, and you got to make sure that the agenda is focused. You got to make sure you have the most important things up front. You have to make sure also that the board members are prepared. What kind of materials are you giving your board to prepare for that meeting, right? You have fulsome discussions at the meeting. They have to be prepared, and you can't just. In today's world, we have a lot of folks using like board portals and leadership teams just like to throw everything at the board. That's not good either. We got to make sure that we're focused and that we help board members be focused so that they can prepare for each board meeting.
Yeah, for sure.
I would say on those bylaws as well, you can go back at the club, you can go back 100 years and there's so many similarities in the bylaws. They don't get revamped and changed entirely. And in fact, the bylaws tend to set and you tend to reflect a bit of the culture of the club. And your club culture is not going to change regularly. You look at it and think it'll evolve, no doubt about it, as we look at times that impact us from outside the club property as well as inside. But I look at it as the bylaws, they just need to be reviewed and maybe tweaked, and they evolve a bit. But as Denise says, it's the practices, et cetera, you really want to pay attention to and how you're evolving with that. but I think of the bylaws representing the culture, and it's not something you turn upside down regularly.
This is actually kind of magical how your segue there, and this has happened several times in our conversation. But I did want to go to culture, and because the culture of a club is so important in as it relates to its longevity. Because our clubs are all in communities, and when weird, goofy, dysfunctional things are happening within our club family, people in the community know, right? Hey, I heard something weird's happening at your club.
Yep.
And you develop a reputation, and which can ultimately be detrimental. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on how governance, probably more than anything, affects culture, which can it's like, again, it's so much like get to the root, like address the root. If you've got a culture problem in your club, there's probably, in my mind, as a business owner, there's probably something organizationally, operationally, whatever, that probably needs to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start. Culture, you can define culture a lot of different ways, but culture, basically is the behaviors that are accepted, right? It's the behaviors we accept in the boardroom or the behaviors we accept from members. And, when you talk about members and if it's the behavior we accepted, you have to make sure that that the club has rules, right? What is it? Many clubs still have, there's certain, attire, clothing, how you dress to go into
Dress
different
code, yeah.
groups and things like that. We have a dress code. And do we enforce those principles? Or those rules? And so when you think of it, like I said, based on members, what are the rules? What are the accepted behaviors and the not accepted behaviors? And do members know what they are? We talked earlier about communication. Do members know we got to communicate those rules? And then we have to make sure that we have a discipline process, and that we treat any infractions fairly across all the members, and that we do that consistently and fairly. Do the same thing in the boardroom. You have, what's the boardroom culture? Do we have bullies? Do we allow that? Do we allow one person to dominate? What's the culture? What's the norm in that boardroom? And sometimes we talk about doing board performance reviews, which is a good thing that every board should do on an annual basis, and a lot of different ways to do that. And I won't go into all of that, but what comes out of that sometimes is, John Smith over here, he's always beating his hand and he's doing this, and, Mary Lou over here, she leaves halfway through every board meeting, So you really have to understand what is the accepted culture in your boardroom and make sure that we have expectations. That's why I'm a big proponent. I talked earlier about your governance guidelines. What's the charter? What's the expectations for board members? And have we let them know that so we can help ensure we have a good culture?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and great explanation. I would say that when it comes to those reports and things that have gone on at a club and it gets a reputation and what it might be, I think it comes to the forefront when you look at recruitment too. So you're looking for somebody, if we're responsible for recruiting the right individuals for a search committee to evaluate and come in there, we need to understand how that board and that culture operates within the club. We're not going to try to advocate for an individual to be considered for a job when we look at it and there are pieces that we need to understand and why it's happened, et cetera. So that cultural fit and being consistent and earning that reputation over time, every club, it doesn't matter what the club, there are blips in time, something happens, whatever goes on. It's, that doesn't determine who you are for the rest of your journey. But it's more, if you're going to put somebody in there, you do need to know what is happening. What's the culture of the club at the boardroom, at a committee level, within the membership, and also within the community. Everybody tends to think it's a private club and they're private in nature, but you're part of a community that isn't private. And so understanding your relationship, the perspective on it, et cetera, is important. And particularly when it comes to recruitment, if we place somebody, we guarantee that person. If we're going to guarantee them, we want to make sure that we've been as transparent and honest and know the information of that club. So that cultural fit is an important part of what we review.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, I was
We
just
can
gonna
add-
add- I would just add to that because I think that's so important. If I was a general manager or chief operating officer and I was interviewing for at another club, this would be one of my first questions. Tell me about that culture between the board and the CEO. Tell me about that culture in your boardroom because that's your boss. And I want to know what it is.
Mhm.
We often, and I don't want to sell or get into this, but we often do what we call a board advance as part of when we do the recruiting that David mentioned, so that we understand that board culture because we think it's an important question that potential candidates are going to be asking. If I was a GM, I want to know what my boss is like.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So I always love to kind of bring it home with some actionable work that someone could do. If you're listening to this podcast, I hope there's something here that's helpful. But I two questions you can answer however you'd like, because I think they're kind of connected. But what are the indications that you might really need to revisit your governance? And because what I'm hearing you guys say is that bylaws are usually meant to be high level. It's how it's executed and interpreted and then executed. So what are some signs? And if someone feels like, gosh, we do need to, to explore this, how can they, a GM could be listening, a board member might be listening who feels like they're the only person on the board who wonders. But aside from reaching out to the club council, what are the things that they can do to really start to explore, to say, hey, is there something here? Should we be looking at something that is going to be more of a long-term fix?
Yeah. I mean, I can, do you want me to start, David?
Go right ahead, Denise. I'll follow.
No, and I think it's a great question, and I mean, the culture in your club. We've just talked a lot about that, and if you're not hearing good things about the board, and you just say, oh, they're just kind of in secret, and we don't really agree what they're doing, something has to be fixed, and I would encourage general managers to be proactive about helping the board do its work for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. That the more you help your board be better, the more you're going to create, the more you're going to help yourself, because we want to have a good relationship between the board and the CEO, or the board and the general manager. But you asked too about things that they can do if they know something's if the GM feels something's off and they feel that culture in the boardroom. What can you really do? One, I would really look at what are the past processes? How is the board actually doing its work right now? Understand that. Then I would talk with, and I would do some research. Look at, like Club Benchmarking often has some good stats. There's articles. Talk to different folks like, David and I, and there's other consultants, other groups too. But talk to them about what are the, what kind of board practices are you seeing that's effective? Get some facts so that you can have a good conversation with either your board president, or if it's not the board president, somebody that you think is attuned to better governance. Kind of get a friend, somebody that can be on your team to help you talk about this. And then, and share with that person what you're seeing, best practices in the club industry, right? Share with them what others are doing. Discuss the importance of boards taking a pause to look at how we do our work. By doing that pause, sometimes I say that I didn't make up the saying, but I love it. The 7 most dangerous words in the English language are, we've always done it this way. And if that's what your board's doing, let's think about how do we evolve our processes, right? You want the board to, again, periodically, push that pause button, look at how we do our work. Are there things, generally when you do that, you're going to affirm some really good practices the board does. You're also going to learn some places where, you know what, maybe we could do better here. How can we make our processes better? How can we demonstrate? I think for the board, it's about demonstrating their accountability. How do we demonstrate our accountability both to the GM and to our members? That's how we talk about culture. We want to be able to do that. So consider if I'm a GM just thinking about changing this, again, I'm going to look at what are best practices, what are other clubs doing. I'm going to find somebody on the board that I can really talk to. Maybe you have a governance committee that can help you talk through some of these things. Arrange some time on the board. Maybe it's just an hour, maybe it's 30 minutes, but talk a little bit put on your board agenda. Let's take a pause and talk about how our board does its work. How do we prepare our agendas? What are the processes we do? What are the policies that we have in our board policy manual?
Got it. Awesome.
Yeah. And I think that you led off, Ed, with a statement, what do you do? What action do you take? And how do you know when it's time? And sometimes best practices you don't know about unless you start researching and looking. And the individual best governance doesn't just happen. It has to be a process. It's got to be something that someone owns. And I think, as Denise pointed out, you've got one leader of an organization that a board holds accountable and usually is there for a longer period of time than the other transitional people. And you look at it and go, you own it. There's something that can be done. And being passive is not the way. It's really being more progressive, looking at it, as Denise says, researching it, comparing it, coming up with where you are. If anything, a retreat once a year, and a retreat can be a half day in the clubhouse or whatever. Don't make it into something where you're traveling to a different city or whatever. And it's always good to have a third party sitting at the table, but at least once a year, step back, look at it, and conduct an overview of how you operate, what you see in the industry today. How could we be better at what we do? And I think that element of it is one that slips by because it's tough to take ownership in it. It's not something that is immediately pending on many managers' desks, and it might not even be part of an annual review of a COO of an organization, and should be, as to how are you helping us evolve in governance.
Yeah, David mentioned, getting better. And, we like to say the whole board governance piece and working with the board, it's always about getting better at getting better, right? That's what we want to do. We want to keep learning. We want to get better at getting better.
Yeah. As we say, it's progress, not perfection,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. And it's not that you're broken. Many times they don't want to hear that they're broken. They're proud of being an officer. They're proud of being on the board. They don't want to hear they're broken.
Right.
Well, this isn't about being broken. This is about being better. And if you can get that mindset, it helps.
That's awesome. Denise and David, I've learned so much, and it's been really, really helpful. Hopefully our listeners feel the same way. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your expertise and wisdom.
Well, it's been fun talking with you, Ed. I enjoyed this opportunity to meet you, and I hope we get to have more conversations.
Ed, with great respect, what you do is really helping our industry out there. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that. And I look forward to catching up again sometime soon. And thank you for listening. If you find this podcast helpful, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, keep crushing your club marketing.